if you're not faithful with the very first thing God gives you, then you can't expect to build on top of that, mining, manufacturing, industry, trade, art, culture, all those other things. If you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you're not really at liberty to do that.
There are issues, there are problems with agriculture. And I think oftentimes those are man-made problems. Probably most of the time they're man-made problems because as sinful human beings, we tend to oftentimes mess up what God created in perfection. So talk through some of those with us. What are some of the things that we maybe need to be aware of?
Yeah, well, we live in, a time where we have this incredible food system that enables a lot of us not to have to worry about food. Like many people in the world do. I was just listening to a friend of mine yesterday saying how, when he goes to places like Africa and they're sharing with them, a meal as a guest, sometimes you're eating the food and these people that are sharing with you don't even know where they're going to get the food for tomorrow.
Yeah.
They live like that. We don't even have to think about it here because of this incredible system that we're a part of, food system, but it's important as Christians that we understand that we are not omnipotent as human beings. And throughout history, the basic foundation of any economy is its agriculture. I don't believe that God wants everybody to be a farmer.
Right.
But it's kind of like if you're not faithful with the very first thing God gives you, then you can't expect to build on top of that, mining, manufacturing, industry, trade, art, culture, all those other things. If you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you're not really at liberty to do that. Yeah. So it's important for us, whether or not we feel called to agriculture, to be aware of the health of the agricultural foundation in the economy that we live in. Mm-hmm. And so while we benefit from, that ability to just go to the grocery store and typically get everything that we see anytime we want, if we look at some of these, there are some root problems, though, that could potentially cause a lot of issues in the future with farming. One of those, an indicator is farming is not a very profitable venture in this day and age. It's very difficult to make a living farming. Think the average, if you look at the median income for U.S. farmers, like in 2021, if you look at the median average income for farming households from their farm, is $210 nationwide. So about 90% of farm households in the U.S. receive most of their income from off-farm jobs. So you're basically using an off-farm job to subsidize your farming habit in a sense. And there's a lot of things that play into that with the models that we've got, the scale that's required, subsidies, kind of the market, all these weird things that it should just be as a regular profitable thing like anything else. But there is a particular difficulty of it's hard for anybody to realistically encourage young people to go into the normal style of farming that we see today, because either you've got to, go millions and millions of dollars in debt, or be born into it. And so that's not normally like something that's easy to do. So that's a challenge. And one of the things that has produced is very few new farmers. The population of farmers in the U.S. is 57 is the average age today, to be exact. So 57 is the average age of the farmer. And that's been something that's gone up, and is just continuing to rise. And part of that's because, how do you transfer that? How do you make it attractive? If you don't have a pipeline for these new farmers coming along, then it's really challenging. It just isn't an indicator of health in that sector if you don't have new young people coming into it.
Right.
And then we have very, amazing complex food systems and GPS tractors and all that kind of cool stuff. But when we saw with some of the disruptions in COVID, our farms in the U.S. are not the resilient, self-sustaining operations that they used to be, where we're using the manure from the cows to fertilize the crops and the grass from the farm to feed the cows, and this kind of at least localized input and system and dependency. And now it's if there's some kind of disruption, whether it's the Ukrainian war or if things, embargoes from Russia on, fertilizer or whatever, it impacts the price of stuff locally in your community, which is it's much more dependent on things that are outside of our control, which is not really where you want your food
Right.
being, because we can do without like imported luxury goods or conveniences, but we can't do without the things that we need for survival. And
Yeah.
so we have this fragile centralized production. And then sadly, because we've focused mostly on quantity and scale and cheapness and all that stuff, farmers have not been we've been incentivized to go away from kind of these God's way of life, like happy chickens, and kind of treating life as something non-special, which has resulted, unfortunately, in food that doesn't produce healthy people and doesn't produce healthy land, systems that are not healing the land.
Right.
And so in the U.S., we don't have people starving to death like we do in Africa, but obesity is a form of starvation. It's like a malnutrition. It's you're always hungry and trying to eat empty carbs. But nowadays we have corn varieties that produces twice as much per acre, but they haven't increased twice as much in the capability to uptake nutrients. So now it's like you've got to eat twice as many carbs to get the same like vitamins, in a sense, in corn as we did. And we think, oh, yay, we're getting twice as much yield. But how are we helping people? So a lot of this, I just recognize, and I believe it's just a result of whenever we see death is, Satan came to kill, steal, and destroy, right? When we see like this kind of these bad fruit, it's really should always go back. We can always trace it as Christians back to sin. And how is this a reflection of our pride, our unfaithfulness, and our selfishness? Yeah. And then recognize that the solution to that is Jesus changing our hearts to help us to reapproach agriculture with humility, with a commitment to faithfulness, and a heart of unselfishness to serve both and giving to the land and giving and doing the best for other people. And that's what we found it really does provide viable solutions to these kind of challenges that we face. But it's not something you're going to fix overnight.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's us trying to take control of what God has already created and trying to do it our way instead of his way. And that never turns out so well, does it? There's always a mess in there.
Yeah. We can easily in any area of life, whether, it could be education, it could be anything else, on one hand, we can have legalism where we can be like, this is the way you should do it. And this is the result you're going to get. And over here, it's like, well, there's grace. You can do it however you want. God doesn't really care. As long as you're doing it for him, it'll all work out, and neither one of those is really accurate because neither one really needs God.
Right.
God wants us coming to him to say, how can I reflect you in what I'm doing in my situation with my starting point? How can I grow to be able to do that more and more? And there's a humility that's required for that we can't just like say, I've got the formula and everybody else should do this, and then that'll fix their problems. Typically that ends up in pretty miserable failure if you take that kind of approach, and divisiveness too.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you imagine living in the Garden of Eden and how perfect and beautiful it must have been and how wonderful the food must have been and everything was perfection at that time? I can't wait to get to heaven and have that all over again and won't mess it up there. Homeschool Insights is sponsored by CTC Math. If you're looking for a great online math program, visit ctcmath.com and try it for free. For more great homeschool inspiration and resources, listen to the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday.